Yes, so on Tuesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu finally was able to get rid of one of his longest-lasting enemies and move the war there in a different direction. And by that, I mean his defense minister. So Tuesday was when he fired Yoav Gallant, who has been defense minister in Netanyahu's cabinet for more or less since the start, certainly the start of the war. He's lasted this long. Why did it take so long, and why now? Well, on a video Netanyahu uploaded on his X account, we can play the B-roll footage for that. It's unfortunately in Hebrew, but a little small quote from that here. Between me and Defense Minister Gallant, significant gaps emerged regarding the management of the campaign, and these gaps were accompanied by statements and actions that contradicted government decisions and cabinet decisions, end quote. So, per to be expected, he was a bit vague on the details, but the gist is Gallant has basically, or Netanyahu is accusing Gallant of insubordination and being public about it for both the Israeli public and Israel's enemies to see. That's not a good mix, especially when you're dealing with a leader like Netanyahu, who is a very shrewd politician and knows how to outmaneuver his political enemies.
So in some ways, similar to Germany, minister being fired due to insubordination, refusing to do what the Chancellor wants, a much more serious situation in many ways because Israel is at war while Germany isn't. Is this the end of the coalition for Netanyahu the way that it is for Germany, or what that picture going forwards?
I would actually disagree with you with something you said earlier in the sense that it's not a more serious problem because it's not going to mean the end of the coalition. Gallant is part of Netanyahu's Likud party, and he is a bit of a shall we say, a bit of a lone wolf within the party. It's like, for example, when the judicial reform bills were being passed before the war started, he was one of the lone dissenters within the party itself. Regarding the cabinet that Netanyahu mentioned, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who leads one of the major parties within Netanyahu's coalition, applauded the move. He's the national security minister in Israel, and also ties in with who's replacing not just Gallant, but also the follow-up effects of some of these cabinet reshufflings. Israel Katz, Israel's foreign minister, will be replacing Gallant as defense minister. He's a longtime Netanyahu loyalist, has been in Israeli politics for decades. He took over as foreign minister this year after ousting Eli Cohen, most likely due to, in part at least, Cohen announcing prematurely that Israel was making relations with Libya, which of course caused the Libyan government to deny that, and that caused a big fiasco that way. But the big thing to notice with this is not necessarily Katz taking over the defense ministry, but who's taking over from him as foreign minister, and that would be Gideon Sa'ar, who is a former Likud member, had a spat with Netanyahu a number of years ago, started his own party, joined the anti-Netanyahu bloc that ended up becoming the Bennett-Lapid government. He served as justice minister under that. That obviously collapsed. When the war started, his party, as well as Benny Gantz's party, joined the war coalition as ministers without portfolio, as general right-wing parties to give their input as a united front. Those fell apart, but Sa'ar managed to eventually join the coalition again. And now he's going to be the new foreign minister of Israel, which in one sense gives him incentive to stick on with the government, creating more of a united atmosphere, you could say.
So in Germany, they fire a minister and the government falls apart. In Israel, what you're saying is he fired a minister and the coalition is more stable now.
Yes, exactly.
So I just want to check. You mentioned Gideon Sa'ar. He used to be a Netanyahu member. He quit. He formed his own party. He went to that feels like that's a bit of a pattern with Benjamin Netanyahu. He does often end up offending people, or he has these enemies that go off in a huff. Is his former defense minister, is there a risk of him doing the same? I mean, you mentioned he was kind of isolated in the party, so I guess that risk would be fairly minimal that he quits and forms his own party and takes some people with him.
It's too early to say. He has since come out and been a little more unhinged with or less reserved with his criticism of Netanyahu, calling him corrupt and whatnot. Regarding what actually divided them, the biggest they haven't said, of course, but just from the history, most likely it has to do with Gallant's desire to move on with the war with Gaza, to get a hostage deal going, to focus everything on Hezbollah, move the IDS focus there, while Netanyahu wants Hamas completely liquidated before that happens. Gallant was also seen as a important intermediary between Netanyahu and the Biden administration in trying to get the two sides together for weapons deals or the Israeli government to accept American limits, etc. Just the fact that he has those links alone might suggest maybe this. It's not uncommon for this administration, especially, to be meddling in Israeli politics. And for the Israeli left's part, there are plenty of protesters on the street that are ostensibly coming out in support of Gallant. It doesn't really take them much to go out and protest against Netanyahu anyway. So you could very well see him split off and form his own right-wing but anybody but Bibi party to replace what Sa'ar used to be. But even if that's the case, he wouldn't really have that much power, especially now that Sa'ar looks like he's going to stay. And for his part, he is generally more in line with Netanyahu's prosecution of the war than even Gallant himself was. So in this way, Netanyahu almost gets to have a more powerful ally, like replacing everything that, as you said, makes his coalition more stable.
It's almost a mirror image, I guess, of what we've seen in the United States over the last 3-4 years, where you've got these never-Trumpers. Even J.D. Vance was pretty critical of Donald Trump before. Dropping that criticism and coming and being part of a coalition in terms of all political parties are coalitions of people with different beliefs. Now we're seeing something similar happen in Israel with former enemies getting behind Netanyahu.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because Tuesday was also the day when the American election happened. And granted, this firing, there have been rumblings that something like this was going to happen for a while. There was rumblings that even Sa'ar was going to jump in somehow for a while. I'm not suggesting that this was specifically timed for the elections, but it is, at the very least, very interesting timing, especially considering the close relationship that Donald Trump had with Netanyahu when both of them were in office together. The fact that you had the Gallant dismissed the same day Harris lost the vote. We're not the only ones that noticed that. The Wall Street Journal had a headline claiming, quote, "In one day, 2 of the biggest breaks on Israel's Netanyahu disappeared," end quote. So with Gallant gone, with this division between the Defense Ministry and the Prime Minister's office gone, with, in Katz's case, somebody that's more firmly under Netanyahu's vision, and Sa'ar also being, I guess you could say, in that mold for the time being, you could see Netanyahu starting to hit the gas, so to speak, on the war a lot more than he's done before, especially now that he knows that Trump is coming back in, making statements like, if the hostages aren't back before I'm in office, Hamas is going to pay. And Trump, for his own part, has told Netanyahu, I want you to finish the war, and I want you to finish it quickly, preferably before I come into office. In other words, the green light. Everything that Biden's been holding you back on, forget about it. Go full steam ahead. Let's get this over and done with as quickly as possible. You could very well see, Israel take on a much more offensive posture with less strings pulling them behind, and B, Hamas, now that they know that their buddy in Washington is about to be gone soon, that their buddies, so to speak, in the Israeli government are going to be gone soon, they have a lot less leverage on Netanyahu now. They might be a little more malleable for a surrender agreement or something like that. And the reason I wanted to bring this up now is that this is something that we're watching for specifically between those two individuals, Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu, to almost synergize the revivals of both America and the State of Israel. A chapter that we went to plenty in the program you did about the election, 2 Kings 14, which speaks of there being no helper for Israel and that God saved Israel by the hand of Jeroboam. And we look at that as a prophecy of God using a certain individual under the prophetic parallel, I guess you could say, of the ancient King Jeroboam to save the nations of Israel, to save America specifically, and we identify that individual as being Donald Trump. Verse 28 of chapter 14 talks about Jeroboam warring to recover something. Our editor-in-chief has talked about him being deprived of the election in 2020 and warring to recover that. But it also mentions the state of, or the nation of Judah in that recovery, in that war. This is what the predecessor for covering the Middle East, Brent Noctegal, wrote in a January 2023 article for our print edition called Bibi is Back. Quote, Jeroboam II had an unusually close alliance with the Jewish king ruling from Jerusalem, King Uzziah. Both kings worked together, which was far from the normal state of affairs between the two kingdoms. A period of national power stabilized both nations. Clearly, the modern counterpart of this relationship was on display during President Trump's first term while Netanyahu was in power. Continuing on, Trump and Netanyahu worked together during the president's first term. And since President Trump is prophesied to return to office, was it God's will also that Mr. Netanyahu would once again lead the Jewish state? End quote. Tying back into what was stated here, just look at this. The same day of the election, Trump isn't even in office officially. It'll be a couple of months before that. And you get this news of a turnaround going on in Israel for the war effort. Like, in this case, warring literally with what's going on in America right now, with what's going on in Israel right now. I think this is the very, very first domino to fall of Israel and America. Again, both experiencing resurgence at the same time because of each other. And I'm sure in the days and weeks ahead, that state of affairs is only going to grow more and more, perhaps, like even with this example, before Trump even enters into office.
So I think we'll probably talk a bit more about the implications for the Middle East of a Trump presidency, probably on Wednesday's show. I'm saying probably because given all the news we've had this week, I don't want to rule out something else dramatically happening over the weekend or whatever, and we swerve and go in a different direction. But I think that would be great to get into more, but I'm glad you gave us that bit of a preview of just one way that this could really dramatically change that relationship going on there in Israel. You had a couple of other stories, I think, to give us a rundown of.
Yes, a bit more of an update on some of the general trends that have been hitting some of the regions in the Middle East. Israel, for its part, is still fighting its war with Hezbollah. It's still making repeated strikes into Lebanese territory, including this week hitting Beirut airport, or a Hezbollah facility in that proximity, as well as the town of Baalbek, which is on the northeastern corner of Lebanon. It's quite far away from the front lines. It's famous for having a lot of Greco-Roman ruins there. But you're starting to see, even as Israel progresses its operations in the very far south of Lebanon, the whole country is still a battlefield, and Hezbollah, for its part, is continuing a saber rattling, but while also calling for a ceasefire without mentioning anything about a Gaza ceasefire. So they look like they're very much in the weaker position with this. Speaking of saber rattling, Iran is still threatening to respond to Israel's attack on it, which was Israel's response to Iran's attack. I read somewhere that given how much they're publicly saying this over and over again, it probably means they don't know how they're going to do it yet, but they don't want to kill the momentum and make themselves look weaker than
you think the nation doth protest too much.
Exactly. And one other note, this week, the Israeli government, or representative of the Israeli government, Gal Hirsch, has confirmed that there are hostage negotiations with Hamas going on, to the point where the Israeli government is offering several millions of dollars in exchange for the release of the hostages, as well as safe passage for the people implicated to third-party countries. While Israel is certainly on the ascent, I guess you could say, with this war on terror, and this could very well be just another bait Israel's throwing out for Hamas to reject, so they could say, look, we're doing everything we can. But, I mean, the fact goes, the hostages are still there, and the Israeli government is still being pressured to make some pretty serious compromises to get them back. How exactly it'll play out, again, President Trump mentioned that he'll intervene if this isn't sorted out before he enters the White House. Remains to be seen, but there is still plenty of pressure, including and especially within Israel itself, for something to be sorted out with that.